There you go. Welcome everyone to this event organized by the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, or CSEP. We are a society that promotes a pluralistic approach to topics such as economic inequality and sustainability, so that we get a more holistic view of economics by drawing from areas such as philosophy, development, political science, psychology, etc. So today we are hosting Alex Thomas, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Azim Premji University in India, and wrote a new macroeconomics textbook at Cambridge Uni Press. And what's special about this textbook is that it takes a more heterodox and intuitive approach to introducing macroeconomics, which is, as you may know, quite unusual for uni-level textbook. So please, if you have any questions, please keep them for the end. We'll do a Q&A after the talk, or write them in the chat and we'll read it later. So on that note, please, Dr. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much, Nick, who has also organized this event for the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. So let me just share my slides. I'll be talking about my book, Macroeconomics, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. And let me just begin by talking about the present state of macroeconomics education so that I can contextualize the book. One is that largely most of the macroeconomics that is being taught, especially at undergraduate programs, have a marginalist micro foundation, a search for some kind or a neoclassical micro foundation. The other dominant variant of macroeconomics that is present is some kind of imperfectionism. So in the perfectly competitive market, you do not have unemployment, but if you introduce some kind of imperfection, it could be imperfect competition of various kinds. So imperfect competition then becomes the cause of unemployment. This has been explained in the form of wage rigidity or asymmetric information. So there is a way in which mainstream economics is able to explain unemployment, and that is through imperfections. The other kind of issue that exists in the way macroeconomics is taught is when you teach introductory macroeconomics, it is written as if it is an inferior version of intermediate macroeconomics, and intermediate macroeconomics is seen as an inferior version of advanced. And where is this advanced macroeconomics coming from? It's primarily coming from mainstream macroeconomics or some kind of neoclassical or marginalist macroeconomics. My book rejects, I think, what is an educationally impoverished approach, because the way to think about an undergraduate program is not necessarily to think of it as an inferior version of an intermediate or an advanced macroeconomics textbook, and to think of it in a more holistic way and to situate the undergraduate student at the center. That the undergraduate student, she is my main audience. The other kind of approach that I follow in my book is to bring together not just theory and the context, but also to talk about measurement, because it is when you have a macroeconomic theory along with the context that we talk of different kinds of measurement, whether it's GDP or green accounting or trying to think of time use surveys for care work. These have to be brought together within this larger discussions around theory and context. And it is when we bring together theory, context, and measurement, I feel that we can say something meaningful about policy. And before I move forward, I want to make some remarks about the nature of economic knowledge. And the dominant view seems to be that of a linear one, which seems to suggest that if I pick up a textbook today, a mainstream textbook today, it is not important for me to go back and read Walras or Marx or Smith or Ricardo, because everything that is good and was good in the previous works are contained in this book. So this kind of a linear view is unhelpful, I think, because that's not the way ideas evolve. So ideas do not evolve in such a linear fashion. And here it is important to highlight that there are contending paradigms and they are in conflict with each other, and you cannot really have a smooth synthesis. Apart from the fact that there are contending paradigms, there are also political considerations by which some theories might have been dominant at a particular point in time, and because of a change in the political climate, you have other theories or other paradigms becoming more dominant. And what does pluralism really mean? And the way in which I have adopted pluralism in my book is to think of it as contending standpoints or contending paradigms. And the main paradigm that I am inspired by is coming from the work of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Piero Sraffa, and Joan Robinson. And this standpoint is in opposition to the mainstream one, which draws from Bentham, Say, Marshall, Walras, and Samuelson. So it is this kind of, and I believe that a lot of learning happens when we bring together these two paradigms. We get to know more about the mainstream paradigm as well as about the alternative paradigm. In 2018, Nordhaus and Romer were awarded the Nobel Prize. And broadly, one can say that they were awarded the Nobel Prize for their contributions to growth or long-run dynamics or macroeconomics. So Romer gets the Nobel, as it is written in this notice, for integrating technological innovations into long-run macroeconomic analysis. In my macroeconomic book, there is a critique of both Nordhaus and Romer, which is a logical critique coming from a classical Keynesian political economy standpoint. But what I want to highlight here is this fact, and let me read this out loud, that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. Where are these ruling ideas coming from? Where are these mainstream ideas coming from? And do they have a connection to people who are also ruling in an economic sense? And some of you might recognize this quote, and this is from Karl Marx, from the German ideology. This is an illustration in my book which shows the kind of impacts that Nordhaus's contribution to environmental economics has, because they are merely band-aids and they don't really structurally change anything about our ecological infrastructure, and we need to do something more meaningful. So in my book, I also engage in various kinds of visual arguments, because I think that it's not just the text alone that can be used to communicate and communicate more powerfully. I believe that we can also use visual arguments to communicate. And my illustrator for the entire book has been Sahana, who is a student here with us. What is marginalist economics all about? And I want to emphasize that this is distinct from classical economics or classical political economy, as in the work of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. And because it is distinct from marginalist economics, I'm a bit reluctant to use neoclassical, although I use it because most people tend to use the word neoclassical, because there is no continuity between classical and marginalist economics. And therefore, it is not the most appropriate label. The core logic is that it reasons at the margin. And therefore, the conceptual categories it employs are marginal cost, marginal revenue, marginal product, marginal utility. And these also go into the macroeconomic conception. And the chief reasoning is choice under constraints. And the main mathematical apparatus is calculus or some kind of constraint optimization. And let me just make a point here that when we talk of pluralism, I'm not just talking about pluralism as regards theories. We can also talk in terms of pluralism as regards the mathematics that we use or the statistics that we use, because there are various kinds of statistical theories, there are various kinds of mathematical approaches, And how do we decide which kind of statistical theory or which kind of mathematical approach to adopt? In a lot of ways, this is determined by the particular economic paradigm that we are adopting. And all this, in a way, communicates to most people who study economics today that economics is a science of choice. But what is at the core of marginalist economic theories? Even though it is construed as a science of choice, what it is trying to explain in a central way is the theory of price, or in political economy language, it's a theory of value. And according to marginalist economics, price or value is determined by the subjective category of utility. And this is based upon certain givens. And some of the givens are consumer preferences, technology, and endowments. And under conditions of equilibrium, relative prices are equal to relative utilities. And this is why this is called a subjective theory of value, because utility is a subjective measure. What about the theory of income distribution? According to marginalist economics, it is determined by the marginal productivity theory, which states that in competition under conditions of equilibrium, your wage equals the marginal product of labor and the rate of profit equals the marginal product of capital. Here, let me again make a sort of side remark, which is that when Piketty is writing in his book Capital, he endorses marginal productivity theory and says that because of imperfections and because of various other reasons, that is why you do not see the kind of income distribution that he expects. In other words, he has no fundamental dissatisfaction with marginal productivity theory of income distribution. But he assembles a set of empirics which demonstrate that what is the problem with a particular kind of personal income distribution. Now, both these kinds of theories, whether it's price theory or theory of income distribution, they are employed in whether it's growth economics or trade theory or environmental economics or labor economics. All of them are employed in these different subfields of economics, and they're also used to create econometric functions and therefore in econometric studies. And it is for this reason that we call marginalist economics to be the orthodox economic theory or the mainstream economic theory, because they are everywhere. What about the classics or classical political economy? And here I want to mention certain things that have inspired me from my reading and my engagement of the classics. And in particular, now I'm talking about Keynes' Tableau Economique, Smith's Wealth of Nations, Ricardo's Principles, and Marx's Capital. One key thing that we realize when we read them is all their work is completely entrenched in their local context, whether it's the French economy or the British economy. There are rich descriptions, there's a lot of empirical description as well. So there is nothing, there's no reason to think that these texts are somehow separating theory and empirics, because both of them are fused together. And to understand the logical structure of their theories, there are people today who work in the classical political economy tradition, or alternatively or relatedly, complementarily, in history of economic thought. For instance, if one needs to understand the logical structure of classical political economy, the ideas of free competition and relatedly the long period method become important. Now, it does not matter whether I'm sitting in Cambridge or whether I'm sitting in Bangalore. What happens within the long period method under conditions of free competition remains the same. So it is in this sense that I write that this kind of understanding is universal and it is irrespective of what my spatial location might be. However, this does not suggest that I can apply this kind of a political economy framework directly to my local context. Because after all, it is clear that the theoretical world of classical political economy or the theoretical world of marginalist economics is not exactly equal to or does not correspond to the actual world. The kind of approach that I take, as I've mentioned earlier in the introductory slides, is I try to bring together theory, context, and in this case, I'm talking about the Indian macroeconomy, and also measurement about macroeconomic aspects, which relates to both the theory and context. And then I try to make some general comments about policy regarding inflation, growth, and employment. In the kind of pluralism that I adopt in my textbook is the following, that I first critically engage with marginalist economics. And the reason that my book might be called a book in heterodox macroeconomics is the following, that I do engage and I do critically engage with marginalist economics, which is the orthodox economics. I point out logical problems with marginalist economics. For instance, the Cambridge Capital controversy debate, started off by Joan Robinson and Piero Sraffa and others, pointed out the problems with which the measurement of capital becomes an issue. And there have been subsequent people who have engaged with this issue, even in the context of intertemporal equilibrium. There are also conceptual dissatisfactions. For instance, I've already highlighted one, which is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, which suggests that under conditions of competition, we will get what we contribute. So one kind of dissatisfaction that I have is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. And the other one is the subjective theory of value. There are also methodological concerns. For instance, I think that methodological individualism, the fact that the fundamental unit of analysis is an individual, is problematic, especially when trying to understand the macroeconomy, which is a system of its own. And this is why Keynes spoke about the paradox of thrift or the fallacy of composition. The other kind of methodological issue that I can highlight is that of imperfections, that all kind of macroeconomic problems, especially unemployment, can be reduced to or explained by imperfections. Now, what about the alternative, which is what I endorse, and this is why it's heterodox, which is the classical Keynesian political economy, a synthesis of the work of Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Piero Sraffa's revival of classical political economy, along with that of Kalitsky's work and Keynes's work. And that is what this alternative paradigm is about. In a central way, it recognizes power. Right? That is, there is structural power in the system, and it is able to recognize that. In fact, as early as in the work of Kenne or in Richard Cantillon, who were writing before Adam Smith, this kind of recognition of structural power is there in the way in which they are organized the society into different social classes. So landowners have more power than the other groups in the society. There is a particular way in which classical Keynesian political economy is open to history, as opposed to marginalist economics, which is ahistorical. This paradigm is open to history. In particular, the way in which wages are determined exogenously, or in other words, it is determined by culture and history. And this is a very important point of distinction between marginalist economics and heterodox economics, because in marginalist economics, it is marginal productivity of labor which somehow determines wages in an endogenous manner. This paradigm is fundamentally social as opposed to marginalist economics, which is asocial, because your preferences are independent of the other individual's preferences. So the concepts of social surplus or social classes again indicate the structural interdependence that exists between various groups and classes and sectors in the economy. And this is very important when trying to understand unemployment, when trying to understand inflation, as I'll point out later. So I thought that I'll talk about inflation only because people are talking about inflation as regards the US economy, especially. So I thought that I'll just make some pointers drawing on what I've written in my book. If I were to adopt, and I adopt a classical Keynesian political economy approach, one of the key claims is that income distribution is contested, there is conflict, and there are conflictual claims, as opposed to marginalist economics, which talks about a harmonious way in which people get their incomes. This is often a source of inflation. For instance, if the wages remain constant and the profit rates are increased, it gets passed on as higher prices. The other kind of aspect, and I mentioned that structural interdependence is important, it also depends on in what way different sectors in the economy are related to each other, or the degree to which they are related with each other. In other words, the commodity flows and money flows matter. Now, this kind of a structural interdependence, people or authors like Passanati have tried to work out what is called structural economic dynamics. But this idea is present in various ways in classical political economy and in the work of Marx. So to actually get a good grasp on inflation, I argue that it is important to pay attention to structural interdependence. And it is only when we are able to bring this kind of a theory in the Indian context, then we can talk about how inflation is measured. What kind of, how much should consumption weights be given? How much should other things, or how much should housing be given importance in the setting up of your price indexes? And it is only after we've been able to bring together a meaningful understanding of the context guided by theory, only then we can make some policy recommendations. So in my book, this is a figure from the book. The key point that I want to make here is this. The general price level is the macro concept. Now, this is an abstract entity. Nobody has ever seen the general price level. It does not, it is a construct. When we go down, we know that there is terms of trade or relative prices, the price of manufacturing relative to the price of services. And when we go further down, and we find that we can also talk about the individual price. In some sense, all of these are at different levels of abstraction. But to make sense of the general price level, what we talk about in macroeconomics, it is important to have some understanding of relative prices, or what I call a meso approach. And it becomes meaningful, especially in the context of policy, only if we are able to somehow put all these things together. And therefore, in my book, when I'm talking about inflation, I also talk about price determination and how marginalist economics talks about prices, and how classical Keynesian political economy talks about prices. And I think that it's only this kind of an understanding that will enable us to gather appropriate data and formulate appropriate policies. Let me also talk a little bit about economic growth. The mainstream marginalist economics follows supply side growth theories, which is built on the aggregate production function, essentially arguing that whether it is exogenous or endogenous growth theory, essentially arguing that technology and labor, the supply of both of that, leads to growth. And in this kind of a growth model, which is built on the marginalist production function, there is a tendency to full employment. I provide an alternative in my growth chapter where I talk about demand-led growth theories. Notably, the link between technology and growth is not so straightforward. In fact, this kind of a relation is present as early as in the work of David Ricardo. It's also there in the work of Marx, and it's also there in the work of Kaletsky, that the role of technology cannot be seen to have a straightforward relationship with growth, because it can be labor saving in nature. And if there is unemployment as a consequence of this, it has an impact on aggregate demand and therefore reducing output levels. For demand-led growth theories, what is important is autonomous expenditures. Expenditures which are independent or autonomous of current levels of output. In particular, it could be private research and development, could be government spending on schools and hospitals, it could be exports. So sometimes in the literature, people talk about export-led growth or government-led growth. But I think the more general kind of framing, and it's more meaningful to talk about it in the context of autonomous expenditures. Different countries might have different experiences when it comes to autonomous expenditures. And I just want to point out this book by Smil here. It's called Growth. He's not an economist, and he works on the environment, and he brings a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives. This was a book that was published in 2019, and I only read the portion on growth because that is what was of interest to me. It is, when you read this book, it is clear that he is adopting a supply side growth theory. And the reason for pointing out this book is that most of the books, which might be written not by economists, but by others, it could be historians or others who are trying to talk about human societies, most of them follow the mainstream supply side growth theory, which means they're not looking at evidence, they're not looking for data, which I think is more meaningful and more explanatory within the demand-led growth theory framework. And this also shows the power of what it means to be mainstream, because other disciplines and people from other disciplines are drawing on what is mainstream in economics. About the Indian context, and so far I've spoken about various kinds of conceptual aspects of my book. The way in which I have tried to deal with the Indian context is in multiple ways, and let me just highlight two things. This I've just taken a screenshot from my index because I thought that some of these concerns are better brought out by doing this. I talk about agriculture because India, given that majority of people are still employed in agriculture, is still very much an agrarian society. I highlight the role of caste, particularly, the role of gender, the link between agriculture and what is called informality or informal sector. And there is this concept developed by Krishna Bharadwaj, who is also working in the classical political economy, who was working in the classical political economy tradition and taught at JNU, called interlinked markets, where she recognizes how power operates within the agricultural markets. And the link between how we conceptualize a village economy in relation to agriculture. So there are various aspects of the Indian context that is there throughout the book, but I just wanted to highlight some of them. The Indian economy has been conceptualized and understood in multiple ways. And when we are trying to understand the macroeconomy, we have to necessarily engage in some kind of abstraction. People talk about the formal economy or the illegal economy. One also talks about the dual economy. People talk about informal economy. There have also been studies writing about peasant economy or village economy. And the main point here really, and in my book, is that there are various ways in which we can abstract, and we have to be mindful of the nature of abstraction that we are undertaking. But here, let me just highlight the third entry here under abstraction, which is the competitive monetary production economy. In fact, when I bring together classical political economy and the work of Keynes and Kaletsky, what then becomes central is we cannot simply talk of a production economy, we cannot simply talk of a competitive production economy, but we have to bring together both the ideas of competition as well as the monetary production economy. Right? And this kind of a view rejects the marginalist idea that there is something that is distinct, or you can separate out the real economy from the monetary economy. And what I try to do in my book is to bring various concepts and the context together. And here I'm just going to list some books that I've used to do this, or some of their works. And people who want to read further can also look at these books. One is the work of Krishna Bharadwaj, where she is trying to articulate the key conceptual aspects in classical political economy. This is a work of K.N. Raj, who was involved in India's 5-year plan, so the initial planning stage. And he has written quite a lot on Indian agriculture. So some of these aspects also come into my book on macroeconomics. This is a book on caste by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Now, what is of interest, apart from his work on caste, is also the fact that he did one PhD in economics from Columbia University in economics, and later did another PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, also in economics. Right? But I use the work of Ambedkar here to highlight how we cannot only talk about class, social class, but we also have to pay attention to caste and the kind of discrimination that people face. When I'm talking about context, I've mentioned Raj's work on agriculture, Ambedkar's work on caste. These are two aspects of the context. But what I've tried to do is to use literature written by different people within India to bring out the context in a bit more experiential way. And P. Shivakami is a Dalit feminist author, and her book is titled The Taming of Women. And the reason for including works like this is I believe that economics can be understood through literature too. And people who are passionate about economics should be able to pursue economics, even if they don't want to do sophisticated mathematics or statistics, but there should be a route available for people who want to engage with economics. And just like we have mathematics for economics or statistics for economics, I think that we should find it agreeable to have courses on literature for economics. Let me spend a little bit of time talking about textbooks. One is that all textbooks have a standpoint. Now, some might make it explicit, like what I've done in my book, but some people might not make it explicit. It might just be implicit. So it's important to have a critical attitude. Some textbook might take a pluralist standpoint, or some textbook might say that this is the way the world works. It's possible that some textbooks might adopt an orthodox perspective or marginalist perspective, and other textbooks might bring in a heterodox perspective. In some, it is important to have a critical perspective of all textbooks because all of them have a particular standpoint. And in that sense, one can argue that economics is not really a settled science, and that there are constantly debates which take place. And because all textbooks have a particular standpoint, what I try to do in my book is to provide a kind of critical pedagogy, which as a reader of my book, you will question some of the things that I have written in my book too. And in fact, I mean, the term critical pedagogy comes only once in my entire book, or twice if you count the back cover. One of the key features of the book is a critical pedagogy. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that there are many open-ended questions. There are questions that make you think about the relationship between what I'm writing and whether you can find it in your experience, whether it is in the university or outside. And it also asks you to reflect on empirical data. It also asks you to go to policy documents and see whether these things make sense. But ever since I finished writing the book, I read the work of Paulo Freire, from whom Bell Hooks is drawing. And I think her work is extremely important. And this particular book, which was published in 1994, it's called Teaching to Transgress, Education as a Practice of Freedom, where she's talking about how the classrooms can be transformed into places where we can have meaningful conversations. It could be critiques, it could be debates, it could be bringing in our experience to play a very important role. And I think that textbooks should facilitate this kind of critical pedagogy. And let me just mention a couple of things. Again, I've taken this extract from my index. There is some discussion of merit in my book. And through the index, I'm able to point out that in order to understand merit, we need to understand the entrenched orders of caste and gender. In other words, one needs to understand structural power to be able to make sense of merit. The other kind of way in which I talk about macroeconomics is to bring in, as I already mentioned when I discussed inflation, is to talk about the meso approach and the micro approach and how we're able to synthesize them in some ways. Right? And here again, I would like to add that in the classroom, especially, or when we are reading these texts, we need to be careful that one is the logical structure of the argument, but the other is also whether we are able to see some of these ideas in our local experience. And if we are not, there could be some problem in the theory, and how do we engage with that? In other words, I think a critical perspective or a critical pedagogy, whether reading my textbook or in the classroom, is helpful. And this is the last slide, and I'll conclude here. When I'm talking about pluralism in my book, I've mainly looked at pluralism in theory, also a little bit about methods, but in empirics, or in terms of methods, I believe that economics education can improve if we, along with econometrics and other kinds of statistics, we are also able to give the same level of importance to anthropological studies, also to textual analysis. And as I already mentioned before, when we mention pluralism in theory, we should also be open to pluralism in statistical theories and mathematical theories. I think that the critique can be at two levels and should be at two levels. One is at a conceptual level when we are looking at the logical structure of the theories, and the other is to bring a context to bear upon whether it's orthodox theory or heterodox theory. In a way, what, apart from many of the other points about critical pedagogy, what it also highlights is that the experience matters. And when I come into the classroom, if my experience is not adequately captured in the theory or in the empirics, is there a way in which I'm able to incorporate that and synthesize that into my intellectual toolkit? So just to, again, to finally summarize, what the kind of approach that I adopt is bringing in heterodox theory or the classical Keynesian political economy within the Indian context. I talk about various kinds of macroeconomic measurements and suggest some kind of policy recommendations for unemployment and inflation. So I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, for this very interesting introduction to the content and issues answered in your textbook. I mean, there are clearly topics that are not usually found in macro textbooks. That's quite rare. So let's do some Q&A now. So to ask questions, you can either unmute yourself and speak up, or you can write your question in the chat and I will read it. I mean, I can ask the first one just to set things going. So maybe more generally, could you tell us what was your goal with the textbook and what made you decide to write it?
But actually, I must say that I think I mentioned this in the preface to my book too. I mean, I never really wanted to write a textbook because most of the textbooks are, more or less the same. I mean, it's very standard material. And as I read elsewhere, especially in the US, if you have to write a textbook, you cannot make changes more than 15% of the existing book. In other words, all of these books are more or less going to have the same kind of content with just cosmetic changes. But then in conversation with my editor at Cambridge University Press, the idea came about. And I was also using different material in my macroeconomics classes. I was using newspaper articles, policy documents, some kind of conceptual material, more journal articles. So then I thought maybe I can give it a try and try to present my approach a little bit about what I do in the classroom and give that flavor in a written form. So I ask a lot of questions in class, for instance, and most of them are open-ended. I expect the students to go back and look at it. Of course, they don't. But I think that part of it was really to put it down in that way. The other thing being that most of the macroeconomics textbooks in India, especially, they don't really engage with the Indian context. And they're just, I mean, they might be published in the US. so that the Indian architecture or the Indian contextual or the Indian unique characteristics don't really come in. So this was the other reason. And final reason is that I also wanted to provide students an alternative. And the research that I do, which is in classical political economy, I wanted especially undergraduate students to be able to see that there is another way of understanding the macroeconomy. And I wanted them to sort of, get a flavor of that.
Thank you. I think Dario Ibarra has raised his hand to ask a question, so please go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much. I am talking from Mexico City. Here is still in the morning, so we are starting the day. Well, the question is if there is already a translation to Spanish of your book. Here in Mexico, especially at the main university, the UNAM, or the Autonomous Mexican University, in the economic faculties and schools, we used to teach heterodox micro and macroeconomics, both of them. But it's really hard to find material in macro. And I believe that if it's possible to have a translation in Spanish, it could be easier to to understand, for the Mexican students to understand your material. Even when one of the requirements is to have a certain level of English. But I believe that it will be easier because it's really hard to find this kind of material of heterodox macroeconomics. This is one. And second one, in this moment, we are on vacation, at least on academic stuff, and we will start on February. And we will be very interested in inviting you to giving a lecture or a conference, perhaps presenting your book at the economic faculty at the main university in Mexico. There are 2 points. The first one, the translation into Spanish, and second one, the invitation to present your book in Mexican university. That's my point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dario, for first, certainly the invitation, and about the translation as well. I mean, I will certainly talk to my publisher, and maybe I'll also write to you separately and figure out what can be done. Thank you.
We have another question from Jonathan, so please go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Thomas. Thank you for the very informative presentation. I'm a student. I just want to ask whether you have any recommendations for particular resources that cover the breadth of macroeconomic theory, because I know, for example, philosophy, there would be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is quite useful for students. So I wonder if that's the same for macro. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for that question. So one of the things that I would suggest, so what I've done in my book is at the end of all the chapters, there are further readings or suggested readings, and I mention what to look for in them. So I think that if you just go through those further readings, you will get a sense. And the way in which the readings are divided is some of the readings are more conceptual or theoretical. Some of the readings have to do with how to think about measurement in macroeconomics. So for instance, the work of Richard Stone of measurement in economics. So some of the other kind of academic material that I've referred to are more related to the Indian context. So if you go through those further readings at the end of my chapters, I think you can then make a decision of what is it that you want to read.
Great. There is also Abid Firdausi. Please go ahead.
Hi, Alex. Great presentation, and of course, like a much needed intervention in economics education. One question. Often, Marx is often clubbed along with classical political economists, but his primary intention was to critique classical political economy, right? Like capital itself, the subtext of it is a critique of political economy. So how do you address this in your framework when you club Marx along with the other classical political economists? Just wanted to know your thoughts on it. And a great, clear, and concise presentation. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Abid. It's true that I think that when I submitted my some of the early drafts of my book to the publisher, I think one of the referees also raised this kind of a point, and I think that I understand that I think some Marxists would not be very happy with especially clubbing Marx, Smith, and Ricardo all together, and I get that point, but the way in which I understand that even if Marx is critical of classical political economy, I think he makes a distinction between what he calls scientific political economy and vulgar political economy. And to me, the work of Smith and Ricardo fall within the scientific political economy tradition, and which is why Marx spends a lot of time engaging with it. And many of the conceptual categories that we find in Marx, there are similar categories in Smith and Ricardo too. And the vulgar political economy that Marx uses refers to the utilitarian kind of view or methodological individualists, which in my book would sort of align with the marginalist economists. Right? So although it is true that there are differences of opinion in terms of whether capitalism is a historical category or not, but because my book is not really about Marx's views on these things, and I feel that from today's vantage point, from my standpoint, it's possible to take what all of them have said and be able to synthesize them. And there's not too much of antagonism, at least in the way I look at it. But it's true that somebody else might find that we cannot bring Marx and Smith together. It's possible.
Great. If there are any other questions, you can go ahead. Yeah, Lingerer Malik.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
And thank you, Dr. Thomas Alex. Very nice presentation. And I have a very small query. When we teach economics, particularly production function, right? So that actually is a marginal kind of production function we're teaching to the classroom, in the classroom for the students. But how we can bring this, aspect of caste, religion, culture, political things into the, broader framework of teaching production.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, if you were to ask me, and I might say in a very informal way that we should teach the production function in a critical way. And I think there are some kind of limitations of methodological individualism which make it difficult to incorporate these kinds of considerations. But I think that with some kind of ad hoc modifications, it is possible to do it. So for instance, if one is talking about the production function and you really want to use the production function, the labor can be divided into separate parts. And one can maybe argue that one caste of laborers get a higher wage than the other caste because of the caste differential. But then if you do what we are doing here is really trying to make the wages somehow exogenous, right? So, and this kind of an exogeneity of the wage sits much more comfortably with the classical political economy tradition, I would think, unless maybe one is able to argue of some kind of asymmetry or information or some kind of rigidity or wage rigidity as a consequence of the caste system in the aggregate production function. But I think that it fits these kinds of structural differences. I believe fits much more comfortably within the political economy tradition.
Thank you.
Great. Luis Daniel Margal, you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm from Argentina. I want to ask to Thomas if you think or you work, the problems of all the new functions of the money, like the cryptocurrencies and all that kind of things, and you work the idea, what I call like a toxic surplus for to what I don't know how to explain in English. For make all the functions of production works, you need the inversion, and all these kinds of new occurrences and all these new instruments are making what I'm just calling like toxic surplus. You work this idea and sign in any form, no?
So, I mean, I have not really worked on this, nor have I mentioned cryptocurrency in my book as such. But at least in one of the ways in which I at least understand some of these new forms of currency is still the kind of debate between, should there be a monopoly in currency or in money, and should there be much more competition in currency? So do we want one central bank? Do we want the government to have some kind of control over our currency? And should we not? Or if one comes from a more Austrian school of thought, one would argue that if there is more competition between monies, it is better for the economy. But I'm a bit reluctant to at least endorse that kind of a view, because I believe that competition works well in some areas of the society and not so much in many other areas of the society, especially I would say in the areas of education and health. Yeah, so how to think about cryptocurrency more specifically, I wouldn't know.
Okay, I'm thinking in fictitious capital, no, like
fictitious capital,
and
yeah,
all what that means, and other kinds of stocks of money, what?
Yeah.
Well,
So right. So in a way that there is nothing underlying it, but it has some kind of possible. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So if anyone has any other question, you can go ahead. Maybe I can ask one. I wanted to ask you also, what will be the next steps for your book? Because now it's out, how will you promote it? How we try to make it, accepted by other professors, other university, and try to change undergrad education with it? Okay,
I was not expecting this question, but see, I think by now, but the book was out in June. I think I must have given more than 15 book talks. So I'm a bit exhausted, honestly, now. But I think, I mean, my sense is that it has reached, at least in India, most of the students and the universities that I wanted to reach, and some of the people teaching there. So I guess the rest is up to them. But I'm slowly sort of moving on from this book, and now trying to write a history of economic thought textbook, which is closer to the kind of research that I do as well. And I've been teaching history of economic thought. Again, I feel that there is not, most of the history of economic thought books are not written primarily keeping the student in mind. So that's what now my energies are primarily going into working on the history of economic thought textbook, which will draw upon some of these themes, but it will be quite different.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other question? If not, we can slowly start to conclude. And on that note, I want to thank Alex Thomas for sharing all of this. It was very nice to have you to talk about the content of the book, the issues we have in macroeconomics, how we can change that, and all of these topics. So I'm sure everyone is clapping from their home, and yeah, congratulations and thank you for coming. It was really nice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much everyone else for joining.
Thank you. And before leaving, don't forget to follow CSEP on Facebook, as we have many interesting talks coming next year. So great, thanks everyone for coming and for all the lovely questions. Have a nice morning, day, or evening, depending on where in the world you're living. And see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.